where you're joining us from, both geographically and in terms of what organization or process you come from. Hello, everyone, to all those of you who have joined us recently. Welcome to this session. I hope this is at a great time zone for you. So sorry if it is not. My name is Lina Salas. I will be hosting this session today with Felipa from our team and with Isabella, who is helping us, as well as the interpreters team with everything logistics. If you click on the little world icon that you have on your screen, you can get your interpretation in case you need it. We have interpretation to Bahasa Indonesian, Portuguese, and Spanish, and the session will be held in English. We will wait 2 more minutes for some more people to join, but in the meantime, please introduce yourselves in the chat. Let us know where you're joining from, the organization, and the region. And for Beto's question, yes, the presentation will be recorded. We have sent you the slides already, but we will also send you the recording. Once again, welcome everyone. To honor your punctuality, we will get started now. And if more people join, we can loop them into where we are in the conversation. Once again, introducing myself, my name is Lina Salas. I am a part of the team working with the ICPH to deliver these briefings. I am based in Colombia and usually work also as a campaigner. around indigenous and local communities issues. I work alongside the Global Alliance of Territorial Communities and with the organization of filmmakers If Not Us Then Who. I'm so glad to have everyone here for this session. I hope you have had a wonderful beginning of the year. I want to remind you all that I may speak fast sometimes. I will try not to do that for the sake of the interpreters, but also yourselves. So if at any point I am going too fast, you need some pauses, or you need me to stop on anything, please feel free to open your mic or to write it in the chat. Same for any questions or comments you may have along the presentation. The session today will be recorded. We have already sent you the slides, but we will also send you the recording so that you can either rewatch this session or share with your team. And we are, of course, available for any questions you may have also after the session, if you need to digest it as well. I'm gonna give the floor to Filipa for her to introduce herself and for Isabella to do the same, and then we'll get started.
Thank you so much, Lena. My name is Philippa Bailey, and I'm based in the UK, and I'm part of the briefings team working between the International Climate Politics Hub and the Food Nature Climate Dialogue. So that's the two organizations that have come together to make these briefings available to Indigenous people's organizations and to the team supporting them. We're delighted to see you here this evening. Or for me, it's the middle of the night, actually. Thank you.
Isa, do you want to introduce yourself?
Hi, everyone. It's a pleasure to see you here and meet you here. I'm also part of the briefings team. It's a pleasure. I'm based in Ecuador, in Quito, and I'm a consultant as well for different organizations, one being the Tenure Facility and other more smaller organizations here in Ecuador, like Sistema B. And it's a pleasure.
Thanks, Isa. Sorry, I lost my mic there for a bit on the settings. It's amazing to have you all here. I am looking here at the chat, and it's amazing to see that you are joining us from so many different locations, processes as well. We're very excited to have you here and also for you to share this briefing's results with your organizations, with your teams, with communities. So welcome once again. This briefing that we are giving today is on the 2024 outlook, which basically means that we will be trying to cover important policy moments of the year and also what are the expected topics and expected results from some of them. We will also have some spaces where we will want to hear more from you, from your thoughts, from your engagement previously with these spaces. And of course, as I said, always be open for any comments or questions that you may have either on the chat or with your open mic. So we're going to go into our first section, which is, of course, what did we get from COP28? As you all know, the negotiations that took place in Dubai, or might not know, hope you do, ship a lot of what the climate space is going to look like this year, right? They have determined multilateral agreements. They have also determined certain specific coalitions, some of the results we had expected and some of the ones we didn't. And so they are going to be definitive to what's going to go on through the year. Now we want to go back for a second and talk about what it was that the United Arab Emirates said were the priorities for COP, so that then we can have a look at what happened with those priorities. The first one was fast-tracking the just, equitable, and orderly energy transition. And here I'm going to want you to have a deep look at those adjectives, because we're going to have some more in-depth conversation about how much those were achieved in what comes from the negotiations. Then they talked about transforming climate finance by both delivering on old promises and settling frameworks for a new deal on finance. And the third one, they said, was to put nature, people, lives, and livelihoods at the heart of climate action. So having seen their statements, let's go into what they said for each of these topics. The first one, and one that a lot of agreements were made on, is the energy transition. So what we see for this outcome is that the course correction has not yet been secured, which in loose terms means that the agreements are not ambitious enough for what humanity and the climate needs at this moment. A lot of what happens in the agreements at COP28 was reflected by the first global stocktake. And some of what the outcomes say in terms of energy transition is, first, as we know, something that was a huge discussion is the language. And the language result says we are transitioning away from fossil fuels, but doesn't give a definitive end of date for that transition. And it also states we are tripling renewable energy capacity, also a little bit ambiguous in the agreements. And what we are seeing there in that case is that they are noticing a lot of wiggle room, which basically allows corporations, countries, multilaterals to keep doing business as usual with not as much accountability and not as much a sense of urgency as would be desired for the current state of the crisis. Now, since we are talking specifically about indigenous peoples, local and Afro communities, we see that certain of the agreements on energy transition mention indigenous peoples. The ones that do are preamble, adaptation, and capacity building parts. However, there is no mention of indigenous peoples either in mitigation or in means of support. And that is going to have a lot of consequences, particularly in terms of finance, which, as we know, and as we will go back to, has a lot to do with where the resources are invested in the coming years, and also how there is a sense of accountability for that investment. Now, what would imply to have a truly just energy transition? Well, while the general text from COP right now is weak, there are some proposals to shift from that language that exists today in creating better conditions for it. What we have now is an affirmation that says we are moving toward a greener world in ways that won't create or exacerbate inequalities or cause other unintended social and economic harms. Now, this comes from within the framework of the Just Transition Work Program. And here are some of the things that we have outlined that come with that program. The first one is that human rights and land implications of that just transition do not feature, which means that some of the risks and some of the threats to human rights that have come with previous energy sources, particularly with fossil fuels, are very likely to repeat themselves if that sort of language doesn't begin to get inserted into the agreements. And then the other one is that indigenous peoples are not mentioned right now as key players or key stakeholders in this Just Transition program. This, despite just how much of the mining required for energy transition sources and of the actual land that is used for those energy sources overlap with indigenous peoples' lands. Now, what is it that we see connects with the discussions for this year? There will be 2 dialogues this year happening around this Just Transition Work Program that will happen pre the SB50 meeting and pre COP29 in Azerbaijan. And so within this group, there will be a possibility to submit your views, your takes, your cases via the UN submission portal. What this basically means is that yearly, the UN and its commissions open certain spaces for civil society participation. They usually also don't receive a lot of submissions, and those submissions are, at least in theory, taken into account to build out the agreements that we later see. There is also another open conversation, which has to do with human rights and climate change, with setting a human rights and climate change working group. And that submission has a focus on rights. So that would be much more ambitious on that term than the transition work program. Now, that is just to close up what happened with energy transition, but if you have any more specific questions or cases that you want to discuss around that, like I said, either the chat is open or you can open your mic. And one thing that I did not say is that Philippa is also sharing the links to the resources and some of the conversation that I'm bringing here to detail in the chat. So if you need some of those links, she'll be sharing them there. There are no questions. We can jump to what happened in climate finance. And what we see for the outcome is defined as basically a mixed and confusing picture. So what is going on with finance? The first thing is that it is still the critical path to delivery. Resources, urgent and big resources, are needed to take action, to take proper, ambitious action. So what we are seeing right now in the negotiations, in the results of COP28, is that there are big headline numbers, but the commitments are vague, and the conditions to those commitments are also vague. We noticed a trend of having trade-offs between mitigation, adaptation, and loss and damage that are not exactly lining up. And there is still a huge adaptation finance gap, which is calculated approximately in 400 billion. Which means, for all intents and purposes, that new sources of finance for climate action are needed. And one of the examples that we think is very significant is the taxation task force. Oftentimes in these negotiations, the questions around taxes get delayed over and over, and the task force is at play and needs to happen in order to accelerate some of these new sources. The other point that comes to our attention is that the nature goals need suitable finance, which don't currently have altogether. However, there are some things that came up from this COP. One has to do with talking about alternatives to carbon markets, and we will deal with some examples of some of them for this year. And of course, the idea that was launched by the government of Brazil of the Tropical Forests Forever Fund, for which there were also several pledges done. Now, one of the features of this funding that is coming up is that most of them are aimed at countries, at recipients, which, as we know, generates a big deal of the bureaucracy, and that, of course, has as a condition that communities have to go through those governments in order to be considered recipients, which then in turn tends to increase operational administrative processes for communities. Now, the other point that we think is important to highlight here is that there was an event done in February by the International Energy Association, and that one had a lot of conversation on how to take on key actions for implementation of these funding mechanisms. So a lot of those conclusions will start to come to terms as the conferences and negotiations for this year materialize. And I know that climate is a huge topic, finance is a huge topic, and we will be coming back to that when I tell you what's in store for this year. But if you have any questions on what happened at COP, particularly, again, open for chat or mic. And I'm going to go now into the nature and people component. The outcome we have signaled for that one is in terms of intention is there. But as we know, intention can fail. So it also requires putting our eyes there and making sure there is civil society follow-up to the commitments. The first thing we saw is that there was a better alignment of the goals regarding climate, food, and nature in the lead up to Brazil's COP30, which is where we think the actual big negotiations in store are going to take place and where the big agreements will be signed. And this alignment seems to be pointing to a synergy between the UNFCCC and the biodiversity discussions. And of course, we will come back to that when we discuss CBD. And there was also a formal commitment to halt and reverse deforestation by 2030. That means, of course, that we will have to start seeing a lot more monitoring and a lot more specific results, country-based and region-based in terms of deforestation. So the agreements aligned on this key topic. And there were also some local starts that have to do with biodiversity credits. We know that biodiversity credits are not yet fully regulated, and that because of that, there is a risk of falling under the same sorts of threats or situations that have been happening with carbon markets. but there have been starts with it, and the starts with it are basically forming around England and France as the main pioneers in this topic. If you want to see a little bit more about how they seem to be unfolding, there's the England Biodiversity Net Gain Initiative, which basically states that any developer that does infrastructure projects must end their project on at least a 10% gain on biodiversity after their project finalizes. And then there's a lot of talk of also France soon releasing their first initiative for biodiversity credits. These projects will also be heavily featured in CBD, so there's a need to keep an eye out for them and how they keep evolving in the coming year. Now, the other topic that we must come back to when it comes to results from COP is the carbon markets, which have been controversial to say the least in the last few years, which have been problematic, particularly for communities. And because of that, there was a lot of discussion going on there on the particularities of Articles 6.2, 6.4, and 6.8. For 6.2, which establishes the ways in which parties will cooperate, the text ended up not being adopted. But despite the fact that there is no framework around it, there were countries still doing deals on carbon markets, and those will probably have lasting impact in the coming years. South Korea, Switzerland, Singapore, and the UAE are some of the countries that pushed for deals despite not being an agreement on it. Then we also have Article 6.4, which was more specific to regulating carbon markets, and the text was also not adopted, and that had to do with a lack of agreement on how avoidance featured in terms of being counted in those projects. However, what did get advanced and is moving forward is Article 6.8, which basically talks about what sort of non-market mechanisms can advance cooperation. And the text urges parties to incorporate indigenous peoples and local communities solutions, which is a victory of the negotiated text and something that needs to be reminded to mandataries of different countries for the following year. And finally, there was a strong move to find nature finance beyond carbon markets, which I had told you before in the finance chapter that we would come back to. So going beyond carbon markets seems to be one of the trends for the conversations this year, and something to be vigilant of as more deals come up both within and without the carbon markets topic. Now with that, and I know and I understand that it was a big briefing, a big reduction of everything that happened at COP, and I understand that you may also have specific questions. I'm gonna give a second for anyone who may have questions or additional thoughts or something that we might have missed and that you want to highlight about COP, and then I'll go to answer your questions. Oh, sorry, I hadn't seen the question of Nur in the chat. You are asking what countries there were deals signed with. I'm gonna be sending the text, one of our references for it, because what we have so far for knowledge is that the public information going out states which countries were making the agreements, but not who they were making them with. I'm going to read you a bit of it that says, well, South Korea, Switzerland, Singapore, and the United Arab Emirates are among countries who agreed to deals, which seems to point to they did it amongst themselves, but doesn't give additional information. And it does says that it's unclear if those deals would be valid under the Paris Agreement or not. And then we have a question from Galina, also in the chat, who is asking about the Bridgetown initiative and about whether or not it falls under the non-carbon market, under the non-carbon market. Now, Filipa was answering there to you, but I'm going to give the floor to Filipa if you want to expand anything else.
Yeah, I mean, I think the continuation of Bridgetown has now developed into multiple strands of conversation that are under the international financial reform kind of agenda. So yes, I would describe that as non-carbon market initiatives, including looking at innovative sources of finance like taxation, as Lena mentioned before. I think the challenging thing about that now is to keep track of all of those conversations, because they've fragmented into different streams. And it's some of the task forces will be reporting this year, so I can put a few links into the chat about that. But yes, I would definitely say that's under the umbrella of international financial reform.
Noor, your question about the deal, if you mean the deals that have been done on carbon markets, there is no information that it connects to FCLP for now. And Gita was also asking...
It's Dewi. Somehow I'm using Nur Hidayat this link. Sorry. But thank you for your response.
And also very sorry.
I will change my name.
Okay, thank you. And also very sorry if I pronounce somebody's name incorrectly. Please feel free to correct me if I do. Gita was asking if on the climate, food, and nature goals, there is any discussion about supply chains, innovation priorities, and the streams. So it wasn't clear on the official agreements or global stocktake, but that is a conversation that we expect will have a lot of development in this year, particularly with the CBD happening in Cali. I think that there will be a lot of work on the supply chain innovation priorities, not so sure about the streams, but definitely the innovation priorities. And then we have a question from Farah on who are championing the link between biodiversity and climate change from the global south. Now, I will answer that question with sort of tweezers, being very delicate, because I think championing is a big word. I can tell you who are some of the parties that are openly making claims about it, but they're not necessarily always following up with action. Some of the ones who have been very vocal about it are Colombia, who has already passed their 30 by 30 conservation goals. There is also Costa Rica in a lot of the discussions happening. And I was missing one more. Oh, and there's also Panama stating agreements, as you see that comes from the AMLAC coalition. But like I said, I don't lightly say that they're championing, because there has also been a lot of pointing out of incoherences by these governments when it comes to implementation of policy. Am I missing any more questions? No, I think those were all. We can go back to them at any point if you wish. I'm going to go to our next phase, which is to talk about the key moments that await us in 2024. And we have made a small calendar of them, but we know that they can also grow. They can also include a lot more at regional levels or even at national levels, depending on your priorities. First, we have the UNPFII in New York with the topic of self-determination, UNDRIP, and youth. Then we have the G20 finance ministers meeting in the lead up to the G20 summit, which will happen in Rio in July. Some of the other actions are the UN Forum on Forests going on in New York as well in May. Then the UNFCCC intersessional meetings that will take place in Bonn between the 3rd and the 13th of June. I'm just going very fast through these dates, but as you know, you've got the slides, so if you need to look in detail, they're there. In October, we will have one of the big ones, which is the COP-CBD in Cali, in Colombia. And like I said, since Colombia is one of the countries that is making a big push for biodiversity action, there's a big chance that there will be big commitments as well. And I see now that Farah has said they are all neighbors. And yes, they are actually a coalition, a regional coalition, which explains why they tend to be so aligned on ambitious goals. However, I do have to say that I might lack a little bit of information on the Africa region of who might be championing, but I promise to get back to you with that information, because I do not have as much clarity as I have from the Latin America and the Asia Pacific side. I I did not mention many governments in the Asia-Pacific region because championing from the Global South on that region on biodiversity has not been very vocal, and there has not been a lot of big response in the last year, but that could, of course, change this year. Then, after COP in Cali for biodiversity, we will have the UNFCCC COP in Azerbaijan, and then the World Leaders Summit in Brazil. Now, we're going to be focusing today on the three big ones, which are Cali, Azerbaijan, and the G20. So let's start with what's going to be happening with the biodiversity COP. As you know, it's the first one since the Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework was signed, which means that there will be a lot of follow-up on the agreements that came from it. And that also means that there will be a lot of assessing momentum to get to the goals. Not necessarily, this will not be, as COP was last year, a full evaluation, because since it took place 2 years ago, there will most likely not be huge advancements. Rather, it's more about seeing how to build momentum for them. But what did have to happen is the alignment of how every country's national biodiversity strategies and action plans connected with that global framework. So what we will be seeing throughout the year is every country's response to what they did so far and to how they have created those plans. So far, not a lot of countries have submitted. China did, and some European countries, but as the year advances, we will most likely be seeing results from this. I would suggest in that case that you look up your particular national governments or the governments in the regions that you work with, their biodiversity strategies, and then have a look at how aligned they are with the global biodiversity framework. What we also will expecting this year is the conversation around fair and equitable sharing of benefits that come from the use of digital sequence information on genetic resources. And so what we are seeing here in this conversation is that technology, genetic implementation of actions is going to be front and center in the conversation, and that most likely will imply some tough talks about how the global north is implementing policies on these sorts of actions. Sorry, I'm looking on a comment that we have here from Timer. You're asking if we have any suggestions as to who to contact to about the event. We're going to talk about the G20 in a bit, and we can give you more insights to that then. So I was going on to the fair and equitable sharing of benefits, and then there's, of course, a lot of conversations around finance, which will be present in all the events. And the conversations around finance have a lot to do with scaling, but also with mechanisms and how communities, organizations, territories can access those mechanisms that are created and that have been created in the past. And there is the expectation of the Global Biodiversity Framework Fund and how it builds access for indigenous peoples and local communities. Whereas talking about COP, we said that there were mostly access for funds for governments. Here we are seeing that there is direct access of the Biodiversity Framework Fund. Now, there are 2 points that we thought were worth aligning here. The first one has to do with engagement or citizen participation. The Colombian government is defining the COP CBD16 as the COP of communities, and they have said vocally that they hope to host many open spaces for participation, but they have not yet confirmed. What did happen already a couple of weeks ago was a meeting between the Ministry of Environment of Colombia and the Indigenous International Forum on Biodiversity, which seems to signal at the urge to want to do some joint actions, and for which the coming actions have not yet been confirmed. Sorry. And then the second thing we have in mind here, as you were asking before with Global South countries, Colombia is one of the countries that is stating the most ambitious goals, not just now, but historically in terms of biodiversity. Now this of course does not mean necessarily that Colombia is a great champion. It's more that it's not a country that naturally produces a lot of these large negative impacts. And so that's why it's a country that easily sets these goals. Jennifer is stating specification here. You're right. It's not that it's direct access to the fund, is that they encourage the country proposals. Thank you so much for that, Jennifer. So it's basically an interest in indigenous peoples to put their proposals for the fund into the country proposals. Now, again, as we said before, that has a lot of considerations around bureaucracy and around the implications of, in a lot of times, working with governments that are against land rights and against environmental defenders. I'm going to go now to some of the questions that we had here around your participation, the participation of your organizations for the CBD COP. Basically, this has to do with us wanting to continue to go in depth as the year advances on the conversation of CBD and how we can brief more specifically. So we wanted to give you some space to share with us what are some of your priorities for this event, what are some of the key stakeholders that you expect to connect with there, and what are your greatest areas of concern for this event. Could pause there for a minute just to let you give us some answers in the chat.
There's a great question, Lena, here from Jennifer about the specifics of which NGOs are engaging with the Colombian presidency in the preparations for COP16.
So I have two answers there. One is the public official information out there, and the other one is the information that's circulating. Publicly, there have been no announcements made yet. The Colombian government has not stated allyships publicly. However, there have been apparently some informal conversations with the Regional Indigenous Council of the Cauca. However, I do have to signal something there, and it's that, like, since Colombia has right now ongoing ceasefires with several organizations which have been broken, particularly in that region in the past month, some of those conversations might be paused right now. Other than the CRIC, there is also the PCR process that has been attached to conversations with the government, and they will be inviting a large coalition of activists with the Avispero network, which is a green activists coalition that the Minister of Environment used to be a part of, most likely for meetings around May. Now, this will be one of the tracks where there will be most advancements in the coming months, and which we'll most likely try to give you for future briefings. I'm also seeing that you were saying there's a priority for track implementation on indigenous people's rights in the different targets. Absolutely. Beto was saying that is this one of your priorities or one of your concerns, by the way, that IPLCs want to engage with biodiversity stewardship mechanisms be supported to do so? I would say that can be both a priority and a great area of concern if it doesn't happen. Jennifer, you were saying that one of the priorities is to establish a dedicated financing facility for indigenous peoples. When you say a financing facility, are you referring to a financing mechanism or a easing process for access? You can either chat it or put it in our open mic. Now let's see, Timur is also saying that you're in process of coordinating independent restoration projects and thinking to present it on the Biodiversity Cup. That's very interesting for us to connect with. there's a lot of restoration projects that will be coming to COP CBD, particularly in the Latin American region. Dewi, when you write Aman, you mean that those are some of the key stakeholders that you expect to connect with?
Yes.
Okay. And do you work with them so far, or is that just a new gamble for it?
No. Yes. And perhaps Ofi could also share, because Ford Foundation, I think, would be involved a lot in the CBD process.
There's no like fixed plan at the moment. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you so much. I was seeing in these thoughts that you're also putting here, tracking actions for implementation. We know that tracking is particularly difficult because it comes to agreements on how to track and how to make sure that parties that don't have the same levels of financial resources as others have the possibility to track with certain standards that are valuable but also accessible to countries. That would most likely be a conversation around that. And Jennifer was clarifying that she meant the establishment of a separate financing mechanism. I think that's a big conversation that, I don't know if Filipa, you want to go more in depth about it, but I think it's not likely to happen in this COP, but I do think that the government will be open to that conversation. And I do think that if there is a moment to bring it to a government, it would be this one on the participatory spaces. Filipa, do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I don't have. I would imagine that Jennifer is more expert, absolutely, in terms of the knowledge around this and what is being proposed. I think it's just very complex in the financing space to. Well, and we will be preparing a briefing on this topic, but to deal with the breadth of different routes through which finance can flow and how those are structured and what provisions are needed within each of those to properly recognise the self-determination of Indigenous people to use resources as they see fit. So we'll be trying to cover both Indigenous-led financing initiatives and some of the large-scale international financial reforms that are ongoing at the moment as well.
Now I'm seeing two more notes here. Galina, you were saying, how are we informing Indigenous communities? And I think that you're raising a key point. We do also believe that there has to be some mechanisms in place for conversation that have that basically tend to have technical language, limited engagement. We have been doing these briefings also in a way to bridge gaps of language, to bridge understanding of these technical topics, but we understand that it's still a very distant world from the communities. Now, if you are open to conversations or interested in finding out ways in which we can either create materials or support you in communicating in different ways so that the information doesn't stay in the few, we would love to think up ideas of that. We are definitely open to and always trying to find paths for that. And the last one was Gita, who was saying what their priorities are for CBD. So the inventory of biodiversity, which will most likely come within the conversation of how to build momentum for the goals. The support to enhance, sorry, going back because there have been some notes here. The support to enhance sustainability production capacity, and the support to access market access and value chain. Like I said, yes, value chain conversations are most likely to be coming up around the year, and also open-ended mechanisms for organizations to give their feedback on that should be coming up on the website. I'm not making promises. I'm just saying that based on the patterns of the types of conversations that they tend to have open, there would likely be a conversation on that. Now, there are some answers here, some of the conversation around Aman and GATC and their participation for CBD, what I can say is that it tends to be one of their priority events, particularly for GATC, and then in the build-up with the regional organizations. But they haven't yet released a plan of action, and I think there's open conversations around it. I'm just going to go on to COP29 now, just to be mindful of everyone's times, but again, welcome to questions and comments here. So this COP is, of course, in many ways considered an arc to COP30. It's like Dubai, Baku, Belém in a roadmap, and also has a lot to do with there not being a big expectation of a lot of agreements going on, but rather this happening at COP30. However, this COP29 will have three key tasks in mind. The first one is to build confidence that there will be finance flow around fossil fuel and nature positive development. So basically, starting to create the foundations for how the agreements that were done last year on fossil fuels and on nature will take place when it comes to funds. The second one is to inject momentum for the nationally determined contributions that come from what happened in the global stocktake conversations. And this connects with, of course, helping countries deliver on those decisions. And finally, as we said, last COP, there was no decision on carbon markets regulatory framework, so there will be conversations around that right now. Now, one note that I think is worth coming back to is the fact that no regulatory framework doesn't mean that deals are not happening. They are in place in different scenarios. Now, this COP is understood as the COP for money, basically, which means that the conversations will loop around how to get the goals met for the different components in which financing is still lacking. So there will be the need for a new collective quantified goal, and they will be agreeing on that. Basically, this is a new version of what has already been agreed in the 100 billion per year that developed countries had agreed on before, but have not delivered in the actual climate conversations. Then there's also talk about how to disperse the funds from the loss and damage fund, and of course a connection with the international financial institution reform, which is one of the conversations that started in COP28. And Azerbaijan and their constituencies have also been talking about access to technology for developing countries. Just checking the chat here really quick. This would be very interesting what you're suggesting here, to have a media zone for indigenous peoples. I would say it's more likely in COP CBD than in COP in Azerbaijan. So I definitely think it's a proposal worth bringing to consideration for this year. But yes, expensive based on the considerations of getting places for for stands and that sort of thing, for pavilions at normally at the events. Now, I'm going to talk a little bit about indigenous peoples and local communities focus in COP29, but also understand that there will probably be more advancements on this conversation as the year progresses. First, what we see is that there is an opportunity in increasing the profile of indigenous peoples, local communities, and Afro-descendant people in the nationally determined contributions, which mean that as all of your governments are right now probably at the table having conversations on what those NDCs will look like, there should be opportunities opening up to connect with them and increase profile for them. So some of the ways that we believe this can be done is first by establishing goals that connect with traditional knowledge, meaning that the way they can determine their contributions is not only the way they have done so far, but also incorporating both things, traditional knowledge and free, prior, and informed consent. And this, of course, will have a big local focus. We understand that these conversations will most likely be taking place before COP and not during COP, but since governments are in the process of establishing them, they will also be wanting to bring something new to the table, and these 2 points of knowledge and consent can be key to bring to the conversation at the global level. But also, and you have pointed this out in the comments as well, is around ensuring indigenous-led finance as part of the financial discussions. So this would be a moment, COP29, to do two things. First, to talk about closing the funding gap, which is huge at this point, which continues to be around less than 1% of all climate funds going to the communities. But also, it's a great moment to present results of the existing indigenous peoples-led funds so that there is a possibility to increase the fund access and reduce the bureaucracy around them. Is this focus coming from? No, this is not coming from that. Is rather exactly well, Filipa was answering in the chat as I was chatting to you here, Beto. But basically, no, it's us seeing what opportunities could come up and where we believe there is space for open conversation. However, we do think that some other focuses will come. What we're seeing now is basically where we believe governments can have opening for those topics to come in mind. And the last one that we have signaled here is the shaping of Article 6.4 for the regulated carbon markets, or for the dismissal of the regulation of carbon markets, depending on how the conversation goes. And that's all for COP29. This time I'm not gonna pause, I'm gonna go straight into G20, but I do want to hear any other questions that you have here in the chat, and we can just resolve them either by text with Filipa, or I can address them here, depending on the topic. Now I'm gonna go into the G20 because I know we had a conversation here in the chat about participation there. So first, for context, this year, Brazil is holding the presidency for the G20, which, as some of you already may know, is the gathering of the world's 20 largest economies. And this meeting has a lot of results in terms of how investments are done, how financial processes get resolved. Yes, Beto, as you were saying, we definitely see the importance of participatory processes. We also believe in them. And we think that every topic in the conversations can have a focus on indigenous peoples, on local communities, and should have it in reality. That's why also when we talk about the agreements that have been done in previous conferences, we go back and talk about what is lacking and where are the topics where it's not being mentioned or not being fully considered. And so if you think that there are topics here that we're not yet covering and that you have mapped out from your processes locally or regionally that will be important for indigenous peoples and local communities in either COP29 or CBD, feel free to write to us about it, and we'll make sure to loop them into the briefings that we'll have this year. I'm gonna go now. Oh wait, let's see. There's one more thought here, which is from Timur. Since we're in the process of consultative nickel mining criteria, in which is proposing, do we think to bring that up is a strategic thing? Well, I think that in anything that has to do with mining, either for continuation of fossil fuel industries or for just transition, anything that relates to mining will need to have indigenous peoples and local communities at the center. And in the coming years, I think that more organizations will be looping themselves into the conversation and will be demanding governments to include them more broadly. I would ask basically just how localized these situations are, so that with that in mind, you can consider whether it makes sense to bring the conversation to the nationally determined contributions of one or some countries, or whether it makes more sense for the general global agreements. But as Filipa was saying, we also have some of the members of Surge here who can give you some more info for that. So going back to G20, and to the relation that it has this year to climate action, the theme of the summit that is going to happen in Brazil is building a just world and a sustainable planet, which means that this will hold a lot of the conversations for what we can expect in climate negotiations, particularly, of course, around economy. Now, the way that G20 works in terms of engagement, which I think somebody already left a note in the chat, there are engagement groups. One of the ways to connect with G20 is through the engagement groups. However, some of the windows of opportunities for those engagement groups have already been closed. Particularly the civil society engagement group is already closed. That does not mean there are no windows of opportunities. We do ask the question of whether or not at this stage it's more listening than taking part. But we do want to hear from you if you have any experience engaging with G20, how and what would be some effective routes to entry. So if any of you have already collaborated in that space or are in the C20 and have seen that there's an opening for those conversations, we would love to know that. Galina, do you want to take this moment while we get answers about G20 to do any clarifications?
Oh, no, not the G20. I was gonna.
No, on the previous conversation, sorry.
Yeah, it's Timur, I think I need a little bit of clarification. Are you working regionally regarding the no-go zones? I authored a paper on no-go zones with the Friends of the Earth as well. So I'm just wanted to, a little bit of context will be helpful, but then I can also provide what's going on with the constituency.
Should I answer it now?
Yeah.
Yeah, we are start first setting the criteria, and then I mentioned some of the criteria that come in our mind. We will produce a kind of brief of that, and then mapping that area. And our concern at the moment is more on nickel. And also we are starting discussion with our Philippine counterparts. So we are thinking a kind of 3 national dialogue of Indonesia, Philippines, and China, and with putting IPLC as one of the proposed no-go zones area.
Yeah, I think it would be great to have a one-on-one conversation regarding this, because we'd also have some plans on regional dialogues regarding the impacts of transition minerals on indigenous peoples' lands and territories. We're also hoping to create a map that will juxtapose the layers of biodiversity hotspots and indigenous people's managed land territories, and also the location of transition minerals. So that would give us a really good, clear picture going into the CBD and also UNFCCC COPs, so that we, and again, we are gathering for the Just Transition Conference right before the UN Permanent Forum organized by IPRI, and then later in the year, there will be an Indigenous People Summit on transition minerals, and we're gearing up for that, actually taking the stock taking from the Transition Mineral Conference into that, and then into CBD, and then UNFCCC. I think it's important that the two of us discuss so that we can align our strategies.
Yeah, thanks, Galina. And we are now we are producing a report actually that are showing the map and also the higher deforestation by the smelters downstreaming in Indonesia. We found that 211% increase of the deforestation since the nickel the smelters now including Indonesia, and Indonesia is planning 80 more smelters. And Associate Press asked exclusively to cover the report firstly, then so we expect, and then we publish in 2 weeks after that, and hopefully in May there will be a kind of the articles in Associate Press of the context. So yeah, happy to, and we have every single layer of the map as you mentioned. So we have the map of the permits, we have the deposit map, we have the forest, we have the proposed IPC by Aman, BRWA, etc. And yeah, I think we have the recipe of the mapping in Indonesia.
Thank you so much. Thank you for the floor. And we'll connect
Thank you so much also for the response, and I'm glad this can be a space of connection as well. If you see that there are only other spaces for connection with the organizations that you're seeing here, feel free to drop your contact information in the chat and then make connections. And we will also be happy to facilitate connections where you think it makes sense from our side. I'm seeing a couple comments here on engagement so that you can see which organizations from your region here are having connections with what's going on in G20, and we can also start conversations about whether or not you think any more information from the briefings will be important in preparation. I will very briefly answer about what you're saying for the people who are leaving the conversation. There will be recording sent, and Filipa has just sent the presentation in different languages. It's available in English, Spanish, French, Portuguese, and Bahasa. So I'm just going to move on very quickly to our last few points, just because I know that you all have very busy schedules. I don't want to take too much more of your time. Just to talk about what isn't being discussed right now and should be, what is not being spoken. The first thing that we believe is not being talked about right now is the nature finance gap. So right now, one of the facts that we think is really important to share is that there's 7 trillion that are invested globally per year in activities that have direct negative impacts on nature. So this ranges anywhere from river pollution to mining and extracting activities, etc. And they come from both public and private sector sources, which means that these resources that are right now in the center of financial systems need to shift from nature damage to nature protection, and that requires reform of financial systems and a question of how is the money flowing, where does it end up, which I know that many of you and your organizations have been bringing to the center of the table in the past years. We do believe that there needs to be more conversations about the financial initiatives that are being led by Indigenous peoples. We know that a couple of years ago in the climate conventions, a lot of the conversations was about communities not having the right bureaucracy or operational capacity to enact large funding, and this has been changing. This comes to that international financial reform we now have, and we have listed here just a few of those initiatives that have capacity, that are receiving funds, that are also at capability to start talking about what was done with these funds, and that we would expect to grow in the coming years with the conversations. But also, what is not being talked about enough is transition minerals. This has come up a lot in the chat conversation, but I'm going once again to this need for a rights-based energy transition, which we're not seeing in the discussions yet. A lot of the mining operations globally that hope to increase demand for transition minerals are either on indigenous and communal lands or are close to them, right? And a lot of them are even built on sacred ground for indigenous peoples and local communities without any processes of free, prior, and informed consultation. So, of course, what we are basically seeing here is the same patterns of destruction and menace to the territories that came from previous energy sources. And yet that renewable energy, which is being extracted from the territories or located in the territories, is not then reaching communities. So who is that energy for? Needs to come to the conversation. And we have signaled here that there are places where this is being discussed right now. So you know that the Search Coalition, which we have joining us here in the conversation, has been building out the guide for prior and informed consultation and has been working on international advocacy cases for this. So you can hope to see more from them in the coming years about everything that it implies, the minerals for transition. And then on our side, you can expect a couple more briefings in the coming months, a couple more in-depth sessions about topics like we were saying, about financial actions, about the CBD in specific, and some of the other events of the year. And with that, I'm just going to close for now because I know that we went a little bit over time. And so if in any case you have additional questions, additional comments that you want to send our way, we are going to share with you a form for feedback where you can give us your thoughts and also let us know if there are things you believe we need to address more in depth or that you would like us specifically to send you information on. You can also include it there. And as we have said, we are very much open to continuing building out these briefing spaces in ways that are helpful, that are useful for you and for your organizations, and also always open to resolve any open-ended questions that were left here. Philippe, I don't know if you want to leave any final notes or clarifications.
Well, no, I think if we can, I would. Well, I can see that Dewi is highlighted there, so maybe has a question, but also just to offer the floor to Galina to mention anything about Surge's activities. So Surge is securing Indigenous rights in the green economy, and Lena has already mentioned the free, prior, and informed consent guide that Surge and Cultural Survival have developed. So maybe Galina, you would like to talk a little bit more about the opportunities for people who are very concerned about this issue to engage across the year.
Yes, thank you so much. We're actually coming with a lot of energy from the retreat we just had in Chile. We had a all coalition retreat for over 35 people in the desert of Atacama in Copiapó, and visited some communities who will be potentially impacted by mining. So the goal of the Surge Coalition is to really elevate the voices and the leadership of Indigenous peoples in this transition and have fundamental changes in how governments and companies engage with Indigenous peoples, but that means the full respect of their self-determination and their right to free, prior, and informed consent. And this, in line of this endeavor, this mission, we have developed this guideline, a very step-by-step comprehensive guideline for communities to come up with their own FPIC protocols, because we believe this is Indigenous people's rights. It's our right to free, prior, informed consent. It's not the right of the governments, it's not the right of the companies. So it's important to educate ourselves as Indigenous peoples how to engage with companies and governments on our own terms. So I highly recommend checking out this FPIC. It was a labor of love for several months, and I think we received a lot of really important feedback. Also, the Surge Coalition has been really active in various national jurisdictions, and specifically in the European Union. We gained some important results with 3 pieces of legislation, such as the Critical Raw Materials Act, the Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive, and EU Battery Regulation in European Union. We just got really important news from the EU Council has just voted on CSDDD, the Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive, and we might have the inclusion for the first time in this jurisdiction, for the first time, the inclusion of the Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive, the inclusion of free, prior, and informed consent, and the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, if it's not sacked in the next iteration, because it's still, the vote has to go through, again, back to the Parliament. So as you know, EU has 3 arms, Council, Commission, and EU Parliament. So it's going back to the Parliament, and there we have a lot of people who are friends within the Parliament who can help us to move this directive unscathed, basically untouched at this point. So we'll see how it goes. The vote is on the 24th of April. Also, the Surge is very active within the United States. We have been working on the mining law reform in the United States, which dates back to 1872. So it's a 150-year-old mining law that does not respect Indigenous people's rights. So we've been in conversations with the White House and trying to push them to acknowledge, the free, prior, informed consent and adhere to the minimum standards of the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. And we really hope to move on to other jurisdictions where most of the mining companies, such as Canada and Australia, are coming from. So this is our kind of aspirational goals in terms of advocacy, but also, you know, the communications. If we not stay the course in terms of informing the public and making Indigenous peoples and concerns mainstream, we're going to lose it. So we absolutely have to be in feedback loops with our own constituency, with Indigenous peoples, but also informing the regular public that they stay on our side. You know, they have to understand the role, the critical role of Indigenous people in the world, especially right now, hosting 80% of the biological diversity on the lands that 25% of the global land surface that is managed by Indigenous peoples. There is no, if we don't understand that critical moment, I think we're going to all lose. So this is the goal. We need to create those communications campaigns, spread the word, but also be smart and use the strategies. Also, the final component is our corporate advocacy. We got ourselves in the room with the major car companies, all the EV car makers. We have been in negotiations with Mercedes, Tesla, Stellantis, GM, General Motors, Ford, and many others. So it's like, I think over a dozen companies right now. We're really pushing hard for them to adopt Indigenous people's policy, and most importantly, to implement those Indigenous people's policy across their supply chain, from the point of extraction to the point when the batteries are being recycled and used and put back into the system. That's, I think, and also dealing with the mining companies, our next aspiration, that we have to make the mining companies accountable. So just briefly, thank you.
Galina, thank you so much for that brief but very fruitful explanation of all the work that you are doing. If anyone can wants to connect, with what you were saying, I think it would be fantastic to create those connections. We hope to be pairing up with Serge a lot more for those briefings, for any considerations that you think are important as the year progresses, as there are more informations coming from the negotiating partners. And I do believe that a lot of the conversations that have started here today will keep going. I also see a lot of potential partnerships forming here for joint actions during this year's large events, but also beyond. I think one of the things that we wanted to be very clear about in this briefing is that while we talk about the events, everything in the lead up to these grants events is a lot of how decision making is done. And so participation in sessions with local governments, in open spaces, in the international consultations will also allow for faster transformations of the systems that we are seeing right now need that transformation. So we welcome you all to join more participation spaces, to join the sessions that we will be doing, and to send us any and all questions and concerns you may have for future briefing sessions, or for future topics that you want to discuss with other members of these spaces or with us.
Is it the close remarks, or so we can leave now, or?
Yeah, I was just giving a second in case there was anything else, but yes, feel free to jump off the call. Thank you so much for having joined us today. Looking forward to learning more from you and your plans for the year. And if you can fill out the survey that Filipa just sent in the chat, it helps us very much to polish our next sessions. Thank you all very much.
Thank you.
Obrigado.
Thanks.
Thanks, everyone.